Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of ClearView Convos. We're certainly hitting a busy time of the year here at ClearView, but we're excited to keep bringing you perspectives across our leadership team. I'm thrilled today to be joined by two members of our Oncology Center of Excellence, David Konciak and Kelsey Yardumian. I'll let them do brief introductions, but they've got a white paper coming out right now on CAR T and TCE, pros, cons, differences between them, and how to think about them as you make investments across your portfolio. So maybe I'll ask Kelsey and then David to do their quick introductions.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Kelsey Yardumian. I'm a managing director based out of our Boston office. As Sam mentioned, help co-lead our Oncology Center of Excellence, so spend a lot of my time focused there and work pretty broadly across oncology, but recently I've spent a lot of my time thinking about innovations in CAR T and T-cell engager landscape, so excited for the conversation.
And David?
Yeah, Dave Konciak, also a managing director out of our Boston office, has spent the better part of 20 years looking at immunotherapies across different therapeutic areas. Majority of it is in oncology, and I've had the good fortune to do it as a consultant and also at industry. So excited for today's conversation.
Appreciate you both making the time for it. So maybe just to get us started, so there's obviously we have an educated audience here, but when we talk about CAR T and we talk about TCE within the landscape of immuno-oncology, like what are the actual technologies that we're talking about and how are they harnessing the immune system?
Sure. Maybe I'll start and Kelsey, feel free to layer in. So the two technologies we're chatting about are CAR T, so chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapies, and bispecific antibodies that are specifically targeted to T cells. Bispecifics in general will be a whole other podcast we can talk about at some other point in time. But the main difference between the two, both activate T cells, but the way they do it is very different. So CAR T takes an individual patient's T cell, modifies it to go basically find the tumor, and it is then re-administered into that patient about 30 days later. Bispecific T cell engagers are entirely different constructs. So they use basic antibody technology where one arm of the antibody binds to the T cell and the other binds to the tumor cell, therefore basically causing the T cell to kill the tumor cell. So entirely different ways of going about it, but they have the same common goal of using a patient's immune system to kill the tumor. And we've seen lots of progress, particularly over the last 10 years around this technology, and we're honestly excited about the future.
That's helpful. Can I ask like this naive question? Like, haven't we been using cytokines and like interleukins for decades to try and activate the immune system? Like at the end of the day, why are these better than precedent?
It's a great question. So we have been using cytokines in oncology going all the way back to Proleukin and IL-2. And it's basically the same concept. It's a way to activate mainly T cells and have that immune response. The downside, if you go back 15 years ago and just playing on the Proleukin aspect, has really been the adverse event profile. It's a little bit toxic, and so not all patients are able to handle it, and not all patients can get to the dose that you want to get the therapeutic effect. We've been looking at lots of different types of immunotherapy. So certainly checkpoint inhibitors have been in the news for, about a decade now and seen progress over 20 years. I think the thing that we're seeing about these two technologies we're talking about today is really around the durability of response that may not be possible, particularly with checkpoint inhibitors, given different spaces that they play in. So it's really the enhanced efficacy. And if you go all the way back to early immunotherapies like Proleukin, it's really about the safety benefits associated with that as well.
And maybe it's super helpful. And one minor follow-up too, like the safety difference was that toxicity just driven by T cells pointing in the wrong direction, attacking the wrong stuff as a byproduct of the activation?
What I'd say is, listen, at the time, it was basically target directed immune activation. And this is something that we'll probably talk about with CAR Ts and TCEs as well. We have seen long, durable responses, honestly, with both therapies. A little bit more on the durability side with CAR T, a little bit easier to manage some of the side effect profiles from a TCE perspective. I will say the downside of both of those that we should be just cognizant of is they do have the ability to, what I'll say is overstimulate the immune system. So you do see adverse events, whether they're kind of broad cytokine release syndrome, as you're alluding to, or something a little bit more specific to the nervous system, CNS, associated with ICANS. Both of those, unfortunately, can end people in the hospital. But what we are seeing is a lot of R&D around minimizing that in terms of getting these drugs both to more patients and also, quite frankly, seeing the efficacy bump. So you're seeing it a little bit more targeted, so it's not quite as systemic. But in all full disclosure, it is something that we as an industry are continuing to work on.
Super helpful. I mean, it makes sense. Like the more you can sharpen the localization and specificity of the activity, the more you can push on the efficacy front relative to background safety. So that checks out well. Maybe Kelsey, I'll ask you then, when you think about where these technologies are today, can you give us just like a high level, like what are some of the most obvious use cases for CAR T and TC today? And in the next 5 to 10 years, like what's likely to emerge in the field in terms of clinical
Yeah.
applications?
Absolutely. I think today, as Dave was mentioning, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the value proposition of CAR Ts and T-cell engagers. So with the CAR Ts today, you're getting that really prolonged efficacy, but it does come with some of the complexities around manufacturing that make it a little bit less accessible for a broader patient population. Whereas the T-cell engagers, on the other hand, have a little bit less in terms of that strong durability that we've seen to date, though it's being studied in combinations and things like that that might improve that. But it does have the benefit of the broader applicability. More centers are more comfortable with it. And even real time now, people are learning how to use it outpatient, how to make some of that step up dosing at the beginning a little bit less burdensome so that more and more centers can try to use it. So that's probably one of the big things that we see happening is how can we get more and more people access to these therapies that T-cell engagers are a little bit better positioned to do as a starting point.
And the thing I might layer onto that is from a client perspective, one of the things that we see kind of as a best practice is taking a look at kind of what that safety efficacy trade-off and really site of care is across modalities and across different malignancies. Because treatment centers differ in terms of the patient base. And so thinking of that through from a development and honestly a commercialization perspective, we think is really important to really driving the benefit that we see from both platforms.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. Well, can I ask you maybe just a couple of double clicks on some of that? One, just from a commercialization piece, David, you teed it up, Dave. My understanding is for a lot of these therapeutics, they're rarely, if ever, first line standard of care. They're coming through a sequence. If that's wrong, tell me otherwise. But in some ways, doesn't it set you up for really targeted, precise commercialization models where you can really define an upstream treatment event as triggering a patient for eligibility, or how quote unquote easy is it to bring these things to market?
So it's a good question, and maybe I'll break it into two pieces, and Kelsey, feel free to layer in here. The first piece is about where they're being used. As Kelsey mentioned, the vast majority of the use cases today are in hematologic malignancies, although we do see movement in solid tumors as well. The piece that's most interesting is they actually are going into earlier settings. So it is particularly for T-cell engagers in small cell lung cancer, they're being explored, and myeloma from a CAR T perspective as well. So historically, they have been used later line, but one of the things we're excited about is the ability for patients to access them earlier in their disease progression. So that's one thought. I think the other thought, though, is kind of what that commercialization model is. I think it depends on the infrastructure, right? So that's to say we have, for example, T-cell engager from Amgen approved in small cell lung cancer. Lung cancer is treated in lots of different settings. So what we see is kind of to Kelsey's point, a push to think about how to get it to the broadest number of centers where actually the patients lie. Multiple myeloma is a little bit different because we do have stem cell transplants used as standard of care in certain settings today. And it's a lot of the same infrastructure that's set up. And that leans itself to be able to, particularly for CAR Ts, leverage that same infrastructure that we've been using. Now, we are making progress in kind of broadening that out in multiple myeloma, but it does speak to the difference in infrastructure and kind of treater base across those two diseases. But maybe I'll turn it over to Kelsey. I'm sure you have some additional thoughts.
Yeah, totally agree with all of that. And I think, like, to your question about commercialization model, if you look back to the earliest CAR Ts where we're being used at very small number of centers, being really targeted like that, it was a much more intentional outreach for the centers that you could really talk to. But as both of these modalities look to be used broader and broader, it just makes the commercialization model trickier to be able to reach the community-based centers that are going to need some more help with training, with establishing protocols and things like that. So I think it is evolving to be broader than it was sort of at the initial phase of CAR T approval.
This is relevant. Maybe just to pin down the infrastructure piece too for everyone who's not just being like for CAR T, these are ultimately living cellular therapeutics that are being delivered, so the handling is quite complex. Are those restrictions the same for TCE, or is it a little more nuanced?
Good question. So to deliver CAR T, you have to be a FACT accredited CAR T center. So you have to have a certain number of things in place that make you a safe institution to deliver CAR T. T-cell engagers don't have quite that level of restriction around what needs to be in place for them to deliver T-cell engagers. There are still some, there are still, to Dave's point, side effects that can occur, albeit at a slightly lower rate than you see with CAR T, but you still need to be able to help patients who do experience CRS, who need to be hospitalized for any adverse events. But it's not quite as strict as you see on the CAR T side, which allows for some of what we're referring to with the broader community use. It's still, there are sort of two phases of dosing for these T cell engagers, step up and then the maintenance dosing. The step-up dosing is still a little bit trickier and more concentrated in terms of centers that can do that, because that's when you're most likely to see some of those adverse events. But as you get to the maintenance dosing, it can be much broader. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the requirements that an institution needs to have to be comfortable with that. And one of the biggest on the T-cell engager side is really just protocols in place.
Yeah. And maybe that's something else to just mention. One of the things we've worked with a number of clients on, again, on the development and commercialization side, is thinking about what those centers are, just overall, and identifying them, but also what kind of infrastructure needs to be in place. I think one of the things that's most exciting, at least to me, I won't speak for Kelsey, is that originally with CAR Ts, they all had to be given in the inpatient setting. But as people have gotten more comfortable with the profiles of CAR Ts as well as T-cell engagers, a lot of institutions are giving them in the outpatient setting, which has huge benefit for patients in expanding access. So a lot of things we work with clients on is understanding the profile of the drug, understanding if it is eligible for outpatient setting, which opens really up the aperture in terms of where it can be given, and how to actually design the trial and put in place the manufacturer support to help that happen. So we work with a good number of clients kind of thinking about that from the point at which they enter the clinic to the point at which they're willing to launch a drug, because it is so important as the technology
Well,
advances.
it's tremendously helpful to hear that, and I can imagine moving CAR T into the outpatient setting has tremendous commercial benefits as well, and simplifying the pathway, improving access, avoiding the overnight stay. Like all those pieces are compelling changes in the profile of those therapeutics. So it's helpful to hear that. Maybe then, so if we put our forward-looking lens on, I teed up there a little bit of compare and contrast between the two categories. One of the things I'm always a very big believer in, agnostic of the therapeutic area you're in, is sort of like how can true, top 25 major multinational biopharma establish clinical leadership in a certain domain. When you think about these two, I have to imagine it's not a one or the other question. Like you're going to need to really upskill your portfolio with both of these technologies to really maximize the impact you can have in the oncology space. Maybe I'd say one, when you're guiding folks to think about how to blend a strategy across these technologies, maybe two questions. One, are there specific considerations you have for each technology class that factor into how you look at the sum of the parts of a portfolio? And then two, are there enabling capabilities across both that companies should really be building towards and getting ahead of the curve on to ensure that when a small innovative company has a new best-in-class step forward on one of these, you're really well positioned as a preferred partner to bring these to market?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think like if we look at the beginning of CAR T and T-cell engager development, there was a very big difference between the two. CAR Ts were thought of as a patient was CAR T eligible or not, with very secondary consideration to T-cell engagers. And now we're seeing that, and we're anticipating that that is going to get a little bit more nuanced as T-cell engagers can increase their efficacy through things like combinations and be able to start to approach that of what we're seeing of CAR T. And so that just makes it a little bit of a more nuanced conversation rather than CAR T and T-cell engager are these totally separate modalities doing different things. It means that you have to sort of think about how you're differentiated across both of them. What patients are you trying to reach? Are you trying to lean more into an efficacy play or the more like convenient off the shelf play? So I think it just requires a much more integrated conversation to think about what you want to bring to the table across the two.
Agreed. And Kelsey, building on your point, I mean, the technologies from a profile perspective are starting to hopefully converge. So you're seeing reduced turnaround time for CAR T therapies. You're seeing better design, just in terms of the engineering, hopefully to mitigate some of those overactive immune responses. On the T cell engager side, you're seeing combinations and better efficacy through better targeting. And we expect that to continue. And that's where it's interesting because it's not one versus the other, as Kelsey was mentioning. It's particularly how might they converge and how might they converge within the specific malignancy or patient population. In some places, being off the shelf is going to be better, because of where the patient potentially sits and, in all honesty, the unmet need associated with their disease. In other situations, having a one-time administration, through a knowledgeable center where you get that durability, that's going to be the win. But that has to be juxtaposed against what the current offerings are. And so that's what we see kind of as a best practice in terms of how we think about it. Because I think, 10 years ago, there were companies that invested lots of money in being the CAR T company or the bispecific company. We think more and more, to your point, it's a little bit part of a portfolio play and kind of thinking about where either technology may be fitting as part of a broader portfolio you may want to invest in. So it's not either or anymore. It's a little bit more of an and as part of a portfolio.
Really helpful. Guys, maybe just one last question then on future horizons. And really, I'm curious